Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We will be having our webinar starting shortly on supporting youth and young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities transitioning out of the foster care system, what we have learned from our work here in New York. We will be stopping throughout the presentation today to answer any questions that you may have, and then also again at the end of the presentation. Any questions you have, please feel free to type those in the chat box that you see there on your screen, and we will be monitoring those questions. And at the time in which Dr. Napolitano takes a break, we will then read those questions and have her answer those for you. This webinar will also be archived on our website, so hopefully by the end of next week you will be able to find that. I will send it out to everyone that did register so that you have that to listen or to share with other colleagues. So now on to introduce Debbie Napolitano, our presenter today. We're very grateful that she took the time out of her schedule to be here and to talk about this very important topic. Debbie Napolitano is an associate professor at the Department of Pediatrics, Neurodevelopmental and Behavioral Pediatrics here at the University of Rochester Medical Center, and then also she's the Director of Child Wellbeing at Strong Center for Developmental Disabilities. Debbie, I'll now turn it over to you.
And thank you very much. Hello. So thank you everyone for coming and listening in today, and I really appreciate your time. This is a really important topic to many of us, I'm sure, and I really feel very passionately about it. So again, I appreciate it, and thank you to the Institute for Innovative Transition for having me today. First, I want to also acknowledge the folks that I work with and the funders of the project that has really helped us gather this information and be able to do the type of work that we're doing here. The Person-Centered Planning and Foster Care for Youth with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities is the title of the project that is funded by the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. And the purpose of this is really to identify some of the needs of youth in foster care and really help to push person-centered thinking and culture into the foster care system. And likely if you're on this call, you know that the youth in foster care are quite underserved in terms of their specific needs, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we were pretty excited that we had the opportunity to work on this project. And we have wonderful collaborators. So the Institute for Innovative Transition, and Martha Mock is one of our co-investigators, as well as John Maltby and Daniel Weisberg from the Westchester Institute for Human Development, and they have been invaluable in this project. And finally, I want to thank Bonnie Smith, who is the project coordinator, and she has been incredible in keeping this moving and helping to identify some of the important things that we'll describe here today. So for those of you that aren't aware, the prevalence of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in foster care nationally, the data say range from somewhere between 28% to more than 50%. And what that tells us is that we don't really have a good handle on the number of youth in foster care. The number of 28% and the number of 30% at least in New York are likely underrepresentations based on some of the conversations that I've had with folks who really understand the needs of these youth in the foster care system. Despite their overrepresentation in the system, 28 at least %, little is known about these youth needs, and they are often underrepresented in research and program development. So when programs are being developed, the question is often not asked, well, how do we ensure that this is also something that is going to be effective for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or the outcomes specific to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities often isn't identified. And so we really don't know very much about what works for these youth in particular in foster care and what their needs are. someone in doing some research for this project and for today called these children and youth and young adults the forgotten children, and I think it's important to note that it's one of the things that using different labels that we have often said about these youth in foster care, that they're often overlooked. And the United Cerebral Palsy and Children's Rights advocates were the individuals to develop this paper around the issues related to children in foster care with developmental disabilities. They said that the evidence suggests that the special needs of this population are not being met, and that the children experience worse outcomes than other children in foster care, and that certainly would map onto some of the clinical and observations that I've seen and from the other literature that I've read. Some risks that face all transition-age youth in foster care, and again, that's the specific focus of our project, are unemployment, housing instability, homelessness, criminal justice involvement, early parenting, and educational difficulties such as dropout and suspension. But you can imagine that these are youth with already a great risk for challenges. But then when we add the intellectual and developmental disabilities to that, we know that they have the most complex needs of the individuals in foster care. They have the longest stays, so that they often are in foster care and in child protective custody for much longer than individuals without intellectual and developmental disabilities. And their connections with their communities and with family are generally even less than youth who do not have intellectual and developmental disabilities, which already are problematic. So I'll pause to see if anybody has questions. No? Okay, no questions yet. So remember, if you have any questions, I'll stop again at a later date, at a later time, and feel free to ask. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about our project because it's important to understand the project in order to identify or in order to understand some of the data that I'll talk about and some of the outcomes and concerns. What we were doing, as I mentioned, is that we were trying to identify the needs of youth in foster care, the needs of youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we were doing that in order to inform the process of developing recommendations and working with counties in order to push person-centered thinking and culture into foster care. And I'll talk a little bit about that, why I'm very specifically saying thinking and culture rather than planning. So what we did was we held forums we held 7 forums across 6 areas of the state: Cattaraugus County, Erie County, Columbia County, Orange County, Westchester County, and we had 2 in New York City. Now these areas were identified by the funders as the target counties or areas that we would work with. And that's because the foster care system in New York is overseen by the Office of Children and Family Services, but it's also county-driven. And so the work has to occur within each individual county because counties run the systems very differently. And so, so the work that we're doing with the counties will then be used to inform the counties that aren't part of this pilot project. So just to talk a little bit more about the forums, we asked for as many stakeholders to be present as possible, and we had wonderful collaboration with the counties in helping to make this happen. And we asked specific questions around the needs of these youth in foster care who are transitioning out of foster care. We asked questions about their current needs, the barriers to services, the opportunities. We wanted to hear about the successes so that we could build on those, and ideally, ultimately, to promote successful transition for youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Just to give you a little graphic, this was published by my colleague Martha Mock and Kristen Love, and this was how we ran the forums. We had folks set up in pairs, and we asked them specific questions, and then we had them grouped by stakeholders, so service providers, youth with intellectual disabilities, when possible. That was our probably least represented group, persons who worked for government or offices, and then we got everybody together to review and to summarize what we had been working on. What we identified across all the counties, and this was really surprising to us, that it didn't matter if we were talking about Cattaraugus County, which is one of the smaller counties, the smallest in our project, but representative of much of geographically of the state, or if we were talking about New York City, we identified some very similar responses. So the biggest worry for folks at the forums were the youth basic needs to be met. And by that means housing, food, and jobs, some of the basics of being successful and being an adult. Some of the supports that were identified as needed were skill development, again, basic needs, and family and community connections. Again, that's critical because what we're talking about is a group of youth and young adults who already are at risk for having few connections, and these particular youth even less than their peers in foster care. Folks thought that person-centered planning could be helpful with continuity of services, so services that were working in foster care could be continued when they transition out. And biggest challenge was systems coordination, and the resources that was most needed were family and community connections and systems coordination. And again, with systems coordination, as you can imagine, we know that service systems talking to each other is sometimes difficult, and the coordination between the systems for youth in foster care and youth transitioning out is critical for a few reasons. One is that most people aren't aware that individuals in foster care who are being served in the foster care system cannot receive access to services within the Office of Persons with Developmental Disabilities. And that's really problematic, as I'm sure you can imagine, because that's where a lot of our expertise specific to these youth and young adults lie. So they cannot access those services. And then what we're talking about when we talk about individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are not just youth who would qualify for OPWD services once transitioning out or become eligible. We're talking about a broader definition, and so there are individuals who we're trying to identify the needs for and the challenges who may not be eligible for OPWD services, and so but still have significant needs. And so there's other service systems at play here when we're talking about transition planning. Similarly, the identified priorities were very, very consistent across the state. Continuity of services, skill development, basic needs, family and community connections, and system coordination. And again, this was really important to identify in figuring out what we had to do when we were thinking about how do we push person-centered thinking and culture into the foster care system. What were the priorities that we had to be sure were covered? So just to give you some examples of the information that we received from the forum, some specific quotes. As far as continuity of services, early exposure to resources and options, post-foster care, transition planning should happen early enough so that it can be set up so the individuals can receive the services that they really need. And one of the most interesting comments that we got was that while we often think about foster care as not necessarily having a rich array of services, one of the things that is really well established in foster care that isn't in for example, the OPWD service system as well is the access to mental health services. And we're talking about a group of individuals who have significant trauma histories in many cases, and these youth and young adults are very much in need of effective and evidence-based mental health services, and so folks were concerned that they may not be able to receive those post-discharge from foster care. Skill development, we heard that loud and clear. There was a lot of skill development around safety. Safety was a big message that we received. It was throughout everything we discussed. Folks were concerned about the safety of these individuals. But there was everything from life skills to relationship skills, financial management skills, skills to obtain and keep a job, transportation, and the list goes on, that youth in foster care often don't have the same access to folks who really have the expertise to teach individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities some of these skills that they're going to need to be successful, particularly in this changing service system for adults in our state. Again, basic needs, and I know that this is an issue for all of our individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities with whom we're working, regardless of service system. But basic needs such as housing is a significant issue. These youth, by definition, already do not have access to a safe home to live in post-discharge from foster care, and there isn't the option in many cases of going back to their biological family, and so there's a significant need for these youth and young adults to ensure that we have access to housing and food and ways to keep themselves safe in these environments. Family and community connections, again, as I mentioned, is significant. By definition for these youth, it's significant. And then we have the added need for these particular individuals that we need to explicitly teach skills for them, in many cases, to make community connections and to make meaningful relationships or have meaningful relationships with folks. And so how are we going to consider this as part of our planning is critical. And then lastly, systems coordination. As I mentioned, they can't receive access to OPWD services even if they're eligible while in foster care, and so it's really incumbent upon the community to really look at what they can receive in the educational system, and what we can do within the foster care system to really help ensure the success. However, the coordination between systems for successful discharge is really critical. And this is one of the biggest areas, as I mentioned, that we identified. So I'm going to, okay, so still no questions. So again, please, at the end, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, write them into the chat box. Okay, so use of person-centered culture and work to promote successful transition. As I previously mentioned, we were looking at that information so that we could then be sure to include it in any of the work that we did with counties. So in doing so, we sat down with the counties and started to identify some of the resources that are in the county, the things that were needed. We used a logic model, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the reason why, again, that I have been specifically saying person-centered culture, person-centered thinking is there are multiple reasons. One is that most person-centered systems are proprietary, so they often cost money, they often require specific amounts of training, and the ability of individuals within the already stretched foster care system to be able to take on a person-centered planning framework that is already established, it's going to require that there'll be a cost to, is probably pretty minimal. The other reason, though, is that there's already a strong family focus in foster care work, which maps very nicely onto the idea of person-centered thinking and culture. And so really the thought was, how do we combine the strengths within the foster care system with the critical components of person-centered culture and work, in addition to the identified needs of youth in foster care who are transitioning out of the foster care system in New York. So just to talk a little bit more about that idea, person-centered thinking. If you think about what are the important things related to person-centeredness or person-centered thinking, is that everyone can make a difference, that we use person-first language, all people have strengths and gifts, the person is the expert on their life, dreams, and goals, outside-the-box thinking, and the list goes on. And person-centered planning would be more of a formalized process, using worksheets or big paper, the process to discover strengths and gifts, and you'd follow a specific planning structure. But again, there are already structures built into foster care that map onto these pretty nicely. So how do we build that into foster care? So what we did it was to do a literature search, and we looked at the Health and Human Services guidance for person-centered planning. For those of you who aren't familiar with the HHS guidance for person-centered planning and work with individuals in foster care, or work with individuals with developmental disabilities broadly, it's probably would be helpful to take a look at these. These are specifically around the guidance around any individual who will be receiving Medicaid services. There needs to be person-centered planning, person-centered work around their service provision. And so we use that as our sort of litmus test, and we compared many programs that are out there to that in order to identify the desired outcomes overall for person-centered planning, process components, plan components, implementation components, and most importantly, what are the critical principles when you think about person-centered planning. What we came up with are these person-centered principles, that individuals can make real choices, that they are real community members, they have flexibility in when, where, how, and with whom they interact, that they have goals that are based on their strengths, desires, and needs, and that they have the ability to make changes to their plan. So now we have two components that we're building into the work that we're doing. We have the important concerns that we need to consider related to the success of individuals with developmental disabilities in foster care in order to be successful transitioning out, and we have these person-centered principles that we need to make sure are part of any plan that we work on with the individual counties. And just to talk a little bit more about those, the merging priorities with person-centered principles, choices, really maps onto what's noted in the forums, that youth have very little opportunity in foster care to make choices, that both everyday choices and larger life-altering choices are really something that they have very little say over in many cases, and that folks thought that maybe person-centered planning could be a way to help ensure that their choices are considered and honored in the planning. And one of the things that I think is important when you think about what happens in foster care and generally in foster care systems, and when you think about person-centeredness, is that in foster care there's a strong and very important focus on family-driven care, and this is critical. And this is not to say that this shouldn't be a significant priority. However, one of the things that folks in the forums mentioned is that there might be a little bit of need for altering some of the thinking around family-centered versus person-centered, because sometimes the individual's desires don't map onto the family's thoughts or choices. And then how are we looking at what it is that the individual wants? Sometimes an individual may actually be sabotaging what's going on because we're not honoring what it is that they are really looking to do or that they want. And so this is going to be something that folks within the foster care system need to really think about, is how do we balance the very important work on family-driven care and the and person-centered thinking and culture. community, that individuals in foster care are community members, or individuals are community members. This, again, huge concern and opportunity for growth was identified in the forum, Family and Community Connections. How do we actually teach the skills, and how do we develop relationships in our service planning in order to increase the likelihood of the youth in foster care being able to establish relationships? One thing that happens within our foster care system is that sometimes youth stay within their local community, but sometimes they actually go pretty far away. And so you may have youth from New York City spread throughout the state, for example. And when that happens, establishing community connections within the community where they may end up living, if they're going to go back to the community they're from, can be very difficult. And that's where the outside-the-box thinking comes in, because it really needs to happen. We can't discharge an individual from foster care without having some community connections in place, or it's potentially not going to be, they're potentially not going to be successful. The flexibility is really important. And one of the things that I wanted to mention here is that there's a new bill that's called Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families. One of the things that that often happens in foster care is that we have systems that really constrain folks, so there really is a lack of flexibility. Individuals are very concerned about safety, and often because of that, and the well-being of the youth and young adults, and often because of that, we don't allow them experiences that maybe typical individuals their age might have. And that may have, the Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act may have some impact on that. It sounds like, for those of you unfamiliar with this act, it sounds kind of an odd title. The idea behind that is that individuals who run away from home often become the victims of sex trafficking. And if we strengthen families and strengthen the work that we do, then we'll decrease the likelihood they'll run away and become victims of sex trafficking. Now, in order to do that, some of the things that are being asked of folks in the foster care system is to increase their ability to provide some flexibility for these youth, to give them real choices in what's being labeled as normalcy, so that their teen years can be as typical as it could potentially be, given the situation that they're in. And so that Sex Trafficking Act really maps nicely onto the work that we're doing, and has sort of, I think, helped some of this work that we're doing with the counties. The last goal is the principle of goals is that the goals are based on the individual's strengths and needs and desires. It's important not to forget the needs, but we also have to really be looking at what it is they want to do. And we need to think about, oftentimes these individuals in foster care do not have access to the types of educational teaching opportunities that other individuals have. And so we need to think about, what is it that they want to do, where do they want to go with their life, and how are we going to teach these skills? We can teach anything. We need to think about how. And again, thinking outside the box. We need to look at their current strengths, and we need to measure their progress. And then principle of making changes to their plan. We need to have a system in place for regular review of plans. Again, the nice thing about the foster care system is that there are many meetings built into the system, but there's many opportunities because of that offer us opportunities to look at the plans of the youth and young adults in the foster care system and make some decisions and changes to the plan. And as we know, most individuals in their teens and young adults do not stay with what they wanted to do when they were 16, for example, when they're 18. So we need to give them opportunities to make changes to their plan. So just a little bit of information before we move on. and how we're using this information is, as I mentioned, we're working with the particular counties, and we're developing what we're calling what's called a logic model with each one of these counties. And in this logic model, we are identifying the specific resources that are available, including the person resources. We're attempting to make connections across systems because that's critical for any of this to work, and that was identified as one of the biggest needs. And folks within their individual counties, I would highly recommend thinking about what opportunities there are within your community to make these connections, because often we have these siloed systems, and the individuals who lose are the individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in foster care, because without connections, in order to make some of these things happen that we described that they need, we often are going to end up with youth who really aren't going to be able to achieve their hopes and dreams. And what we're doing with these logic models is building a plan and using, because again, each county works differently. We're building a plan for each county, but we're using these plans as models for the other counties within the state. I think there's 60-something counties within our state, and what we're going to do is provide the counties that we're not working directly with these logic models in order to help them be able to build their own plans within their communities. And we've identified some very important things to consider, and I'll review some of those with you here. So one of the things that I mentioned is that individuals within the foster care system cannot be identified or cannot receive services within the OPWD system. But one of the interesting things that we found across the state was that there was a great range of information that counties, the folks within the counties, county service systems understood about eligibility for the OPWD system. So, for example, in one county, they did not realize that individuals could become eligible before the age of 18. And because we had folks together from across service systems, the person from OPWD said, well, that's not true. And so by connecting the folks, now everybody within that county who has an intellectual and developmental disability, they are working on establishing eligibility at the age of 8. And one of the things that is important about that is because the age of 8 is when it's not a temporary eligibility. And so we really are encouraging folks across the state that we're working with to ensure that the information out there is accurate, and that eligibility is identified as early as possible. And when there's some other issues with not identifying eligibility earlier that I've become aware of from this work. One is that individuals in foster care, often their records are not well maintained because they've been in and out of placements, and they've been in and out of schools, and it can be really difficult to have a very good set of records for an individual. And so the later a person is identified as eligible, the less likely it is that all of the required and appropriate documentation is going to be found. And so it's very important to make sure that identification is as early as possible. And that also maps onto or is related to the age that transition planning is to begin. What we've found is that there are requirements for transition planning, but what does that mean? So in schools, transition planning is supposed to start at 14. Within foster care, it's 16. And so, but what's happening is that transition planning is happening in silos much of the time. I don't want to overgeneralize, but much of the time it's happening in silos. So the folks at school are conducting transition planning, and the folks within the foster care system are conducting transition planning. And the reality is that this should be happening in collaboration. And the other thing is that this should be happening with much focus on the specific needs of these youth. There are a lot of times that transition planning is not, at least I've seen in some of the work that I've done, is not done to with the fidelity, if you will, that it should be. And so for these particular youth, though, they do not have many folks who are really advocating for them. And so in these cases, it's really important for transition planning to be collaborative and to begin as early as possible. And that gets a collaboration across systems. They're all our kids. They're all our kids in New York. And one of the things that that we see all the time and that we hear from folks is that so-and-so isn't talking to so-and-so, and this system doesn't talk to this system, and there's often back and forth about who quote-unquote owns the child in terms of their specific needs. Is it the mental health system? Is it the foster care system? Is it the developmental disability system? And so the issue there is that they're all our kids, and when we bounce kids back and forth between systems and we don't have a good understanding of even who and where these kids are, the needs are great for collaboration. Community connections and supports are really critical. One of the things that we have done is to really work with the counties on identifying things that are available within the community that may not be funded by OPWD. One of the things that that I think happens is that, again, because we're so siloed, that information is often delivered to the same people about services that may not be funded by OPWD that also is available, but that might be available to folks who are not within the OPWD system, but we're not always finding out across systems about these services. And so folks need to be asking the questions whenever there's any services available, who funds that? Because if it's funded by somebody other than OPWD, individuals in foster care generally can also participate. And so that's a really important question, and it's really important for communities to identify those specific resources. And then one of the things that we think is really important is to help youth in foster care, teach them about informed decision making. One of the things that was described is frequently is that because the youth have not had any opportunities for choices within the settings in which they live, and often were very disappointed by their expression of things that they would like or they would want, that their ability to make decisions for themselves, informed decisions, often is pretty impaired. And so what we really, really need is for youth in foster care to be taught how to make decisions, but we also need for folks to support the youth's decisions so that we can teach them how to advocate for themselves. And lastly, I just want to talk about some legal considerations, because it's important to note, again, that youth in foster care often are also served or somehow involved with the legal system. And as I mentioned, promoting normalcy is an important consideration of the preventing sex trafficking. And so when working with legal advocates and when working with the court systems, it's really important for folks to advocate that reasonable and prudent parent standards, essentially empowering the foster parents to have some decision making to allow them to participate in healthy and developmentally appropriate activities, is made available. There's also some information on educational stability, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which identifies that youth should not have to change or go from school to school, although it still happens, and the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act is also identified to really help with educational stability and other needs. And so those are areas that you can look into if you're interested in more of the legal information around foster care and the youth that we're talking about. And then lastly, permanency pacts and promoting relationships with non-custodial relatives are things that courts can really help with in this process, and the legal system can, and this could be really important in helping our youth. So that is all we have, and I can definitely answer any questions or comments, or respond to any comments. Okay, so there's a great question. When is Medicaid service coordination available to youth in foster care? Medicaid service coordination is an OPWD-funded service, and so it is not available to youth in foster care. It is not only available to them after they are formally discharged from the foster care system. There are, and if you're interested in this, I would recommend learning more about this. There are new related to the Medicaid redesign health homes, and the health homes will provide some service coordinate or some services coordination, and there are also the caseworkers, which is a little bit of a different role than a Medicaid service coordinator, less directly involved than a Medicaid service coordinator within the foster care system. And so hopefully the addition of the coordinators related to the health homes may help with some of this, and that's something that that remains to be seen, because that won't come online until January. No more questions? Any other comments? No? Okay, well, thank you so much for attending this webinar. We're going to end a little early, and please, if you have any further questions or comments afterwards, definitely get in touch with us, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you again, everyone, for participating. Again, we did record today's session, and I will email it out to all of you. On behalf of the Institute for Innovative Transition at the Warner School of Education at the University of Rochester, I hope you have a good day. Thank you.